The Goldenrod Protocols by James Oliver, copyright 2023.
"Shame!" they shouted together. "Traitor!" The vowels buzzed Jack's eardrums enough to make him wince. Lunatics. While the attention was on Samantha, he hurried down the street, shivering with fear and disgust. He made it to a "Don't Walk" sign at the corner and dared not disobey it. He watched the auto cars glide past and wondered if Samantha's deconstruction was a warning. "There's danger here. Walk this path no further. Go back." He even took a few steps toward the shuttle. No! He forced his feet to a halt. There was danger here, but Jack had resolved not to cower. If he was to be free, he'd have to stare down his fear until it blinked. Each restaurant, each gallery, each ink-stamped boutique he passed was a repackaging of the one that came before it, tacitly promising an experience even more unique and exclusive than the last. By now, the 9- and 10-story office and condo towers had given way to single-story businesses lining artificially organic streets, with 3- and 4-story apartment buildings poking up from behind them. Together, but apart. Someone had laid them out so they appeared to be natural, classical, vernacular. But like everything else here, it was a carefully constructed recreation. The Abbeys didn't like organic. Their cultural reforms nearly forbid it. Everything had to be scripted and controlled. He was far enough from Samantha that he could slow down and observe the people strolling around the sidewalk and mingling around the shops. The Golden Boys on the cutting edge of the trends wore their standouts in swanky color schemes like military decorations. They walked the streets like kings among peasants, stopping to sample everything the lifestyle district had to offer. He spotted groups of them sitting at every cafe, through the windows of every athletic wear and sporting goods store, comparing their purchases outside every health and wellness shop, and carrying bags from Fitton and its rival brand Q2 Threads. In each instance, he noticed the deference they enjoyed from everyone they encountered. Creeping in their shadows were the hopefuls, younger patricias not quite up with the trends but diligently aiming for the moving target, trying in vain to fake it till they make it. They commanded courtesy, yet the respect given to the Golden Boys eluded them. Here and there he saw a few ironics sitting together around an outdoor table or huddling in an empty parking spot. He knew them by their traditional outfits, punctuated by 2 or 3 especially ostentatious standouts meant as a damning critique of the undevoted. Scattered among them like pepper on scrambled eggs were the enforcers, their boots, pants, and belts all black or brown. Their hair was always long and straight, and their dark-colored shirts and coats were covered in patches of arcane significance. Some of them mingled with the ironics, but most patrolled the sidewalks, aching to stomp the throats of anyone they encountered who might threaten the hegemony of devotion. And then there were the cosmopolitans, young professionals with streamlined standouts balanced against more moderate apparel. What they lacked in visual display they made up for with constant and often ham-fisted verbal exaltation of devotion, and this made them the Golden Boys' intellectual generals, who then set the tone for the other castes. They had no use for the retail shops, only places where they could sit and wax and pontificate, like cigar bars and cocktail places like Top Shelf. He only saw a few short interactions between the cliques, and they all felt tense, like they were competing. Even as the Czechs boasted their fervor for the Better Ways inclusive tenets on Town Square, they squeezed themselves together with others like them, and the rest were squeezed out. Inclusion seemed more and more like an illusion. Jack could never be a Golden Boy or ironic or cosmopolitan. It wasn't because he was weird, it was because he was normal. Here, weird was normal and normal was weird. Normal was shameful and threatening because it was static and maladaptive. Surviving in the Czechs' world meant constantly accommodating an ever-changing set of rules. It meant staying on your toes, which meant you couldn't take a firm stand. Your focus was always on keeping up. But as Jack's father always told him, stand for nothing and you lose everything. Jack's normalness meant he couldn't or wouldn't adapt. He might as well have been an allegiant, maybe even a prog. Objectivity was taboo. It provided an anchor to keep you steady in a violent, changing tide. Steadiness meant sturdiness. Sturdiness meant strength. Strength meant independence. Independence meant you weren't part of the great big thing that needed to be the driving force behind every action, word, and thought. Even surrounded by a sea of faces, Jack was alone. Still, the illusion was still alluring. But his serenity vanished when he spotted a U-Report video board playing Kevin's recording on a loop. The thrashing of Samantha's soul as it fought for its life lodged a knot in his throat. The names of her survivors trawled along the bottom. Her personal details and the punishments she'd suffer ran across the top. Samantha Park, A2547-28. Town Square avatar expunged W/profile. Business delicensed, lease annulled, property seizure ordered, devotion quotient zeroed. There was no redemption in her repentance. Every living thing around him was a threat. He toughened his nerves. He pushed west, his heart rate quickening with his pace. Keep going. He checked the corners of his eyes as he hustled to the green zone. Who was watching? Who was judging? Who was filming? He'd seen Kevin's stream on 6 video boards before he reached 5th Street, where Nanticoke Boulevard gracelessly twisted into scripted 8th and quarter circles, as if cutting a path through some pristine river valley on a fantasy layer in 2.0 Pia. The swanky cafes and shops abruptly vanished, and he finally felt relief from the tension, a relief Samantha would never know. Kevin's video would play on Town Square and in metro states across the Great Republic for an hour or so until the sharks found fresh chum. But that wouldn't resurrect Samantha to the life she's just passed on from or release her from her unending hell. What will happen to her? No one ever heard from Samantha again. Will she become a prog? He crossed 5th Street toward the contrived country road punctuated by driveways into isolated neighborhoods. Each was carefully crafted to mimic a certain authenticity. The lofts at Lenape Square came first, a complex of low-rise apartment buildings marked by a welcome sign with a minimalist neo-modern font and bold broken letters. Low-rise structures rose above the franchise shops and chain restaurants. He squinted under his furrowed brow to scan the storefronts on the main building's ground floor. One of them was Yum. Next was a maze of cul-de-sacs lined by cinderblock townhomes with uniform faux stucco facades. The welcome sign read Lenape Square Villas, spelled in a delicate script evoking a rustic Tuscan charm. Just past the villas was a grassy hill littered with weirdly placed 6-bedroom boxes along perfectly curved roads, protected from all dangers real and imagined in this perilous urban jungle by a gate. The sign next to the entrance read, "Welcome to the village at Lenape Square," in a benign semi-serif. Who is welcome? Not guests, not outsiders. It was there to let those with the gate code know that they belonged where others didn't. The city was designed to taunt him. You could be here if only. Exclusive inclusion. Nanticoke Boulevard came to an end at Lenny Greenway, a 2-lane designer highway separating Czech developments from the green zone. Boring shrubbery poorly hiding electrical transformers and utility access hatches lined his side of the road. A bike path hugged the opposite curb. Beyond the bike path lay a 50-foot wide strip of grass, a dewy green carpet laying at the feet of the lush, thick forest behind it. Nature kept at bay. The green zone was meant to limit development and maintain ecological balance, but it just so happened to straddle the western boundary of eastern central metro state. The trees at the grass's edge stood as warnings to any children who may be tempted to enter the woods. To Czechs, it was a boundary to be avoided. For Jack, it was one to be breached. He crossed the parkway, the bike trail, and the grass strip. He stopped at the tree line to ponder the wonders beyond. Here be dragons. Bring them on, he resolved as he broke forward into the woods. Chapter 4. Jack stood at the edge of a long-abandoned highway. The lichens poked triumphant through the cracks in the surface as it buckled and broke from the many changes of seasons. He looked at the wooded hill he'd just almost fallen down and took a reaffirming breath before he crossed the lanes. The forest on the hill across the highway was even thicker than the first. The more progress he made, the harder he had to work to make more. Almost there, he told himself. Just a little further, until finally he swept aside a curtain of twigs and saw the boundary of the legacy town behind it. A bulky orange barrier, tattered and worn from years of neglect, placed there during some construction project long ago and abruptly forgotten. He slid his hand along the thick plastic. It had once been cool and smooth, but now the divots and scars on its lukewarm surface caught the tiny ridges on his fingertips. Beyond the barrier was a broken, potholed road. The asphalt had been dug up next to an ancient, rusty steamroller sitting by the curb, suspended in a moment of waiting to be useful. This was the last normal moment. Jack imagined crews repaving the road, as if that day would be like any other. Then came the bombings. The workers got messages and link-ups from their families about the riots starting all over the world. Law enforcement was overrun and the military was deployed. The The workers were called off their jobs when martial law was declared, and civilians were ordered to stay in their homes. They had to abandon their livelihoods and then their lives. But the war was fought elsewhere. This place is untouched. The air was thick, like the town was trapped in amber. There was no reckoning here, but no great rebuild either. The people here weren't important. They were overlooked. They were allowed to be themselves and live their lives as they saw fit. But the price they paid was to miss the paradise of the faithful. There's nothing left here. He wandered toward the wide road leading toward town. He passed a dirty, broken sign fronting the ruins of an abandoned gasoline station. He could only make out the Flying Goose logo under the faded brand name. Weeds and saplings sprouted through the fault lines in the parking lot. The sun slipped behind the distant broken buildings beneath cascading pastel clouds. Something about the smudges of orange and purple above this relic of a forgotten past made him feel like he'd finally caught the ghost of another life he'd been chasing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the beauty of the setting sun was calling him home. He couldn't help but wonder who kept the lights on at the hospital across the street. Devotion level determined access to products and services. People and businesses which most vocally followed its tenets earned higher interest, had better access to medications, could travel farther, and paid less for many goods and services. People like Jack had provisional bank accounts with restricted spending, but Progs were undevoted by definition. They were too out of touch to use Metrobank and too poor to have their own. A little further down the road, Middletown Pharmacy was painted on a cheap banner hanging on a big brick box with sprawling patches of white on the walls. It sat away from the road in ineffable majesty, surrounded by a sea of cracking, buckling gray. It had a history, however banal. Jack felt nostalgic, wanting to go back in time and be a part of it. It might as well have been a crumbling palace in some ancient Aztec ruin. He passed shuttered restaurants sitting like neglected mausoleums, mostly chains and franchises, not modern places like Yum, but the ones the modern chains replaced. The evil chains, the ones that sacrificed culture for currency, quality for quantity, the ones run by idolaters and profit-worshipping infidels, not like Yum or Delish, which were different for reasons Jack never understood. He passed crumbling buildings once bustling with people and asphalt deserts with weeds sprouting through their decay. He passed places that were once mundane, where people went to run their errands and make a living, now standing as memorials to their lives as they knew them. The orange and purple in the sky had faded to a warm saffron glow barely peeking over the horizon under a blanket of bluish black. As the darkness edged closer, he noticed for the first time that his surroundings were barren. His feet weren't carrying him as quickly now. His apprehension had rusted the gears. The sun finally gave up on him and dipped out of sight. In the distance behind him, the chilly fluorescent lights of Lenape Square glowed above the trees. In the distance ahead, a beckoning twinkle from the mysterious new world beyond the sea of shadows. The isolation was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. Strips of quaint row homes lay ahead under soft, dirty yellow streetlights. The clapboard sidings had been worn by time, the aluminum facades covered in rust. Most hid secrets of the past behind their unlit windows and unhinged shutters. Others were boarded up. Their stories had ended long ago, and now they sat decaying, like a book someone had finished reading years before and simply left on the table. But the bright spots kept him going, those few surprisingly well-maintained, charming 20th century specimens. They were alight inside with signs of life poking through the death like the last few embers hanging on after a campfire. He heard happy sounds from a home several paces ahead and crept up to peer through the window. A couple sat on the couch, with another prog in the chair next to it and another leaning against the wall clutching a brown bottle. The cold light from the old TV bathed their faces, but the coral-colored paint on the walls kept the room cozy. Two children sat on the carpet, staring in awe at the screen. Two women appeared from the kitchen doorway at the back of the dining room carrying feasts on trays and joined the rest. He didn't know why he so longed to be on the other side of that window. The laughter, the bonding, the primal joy of breaking bread with those you love? Or is it the soothing color on the walls? A constant, blissful sunset. He savored one last moment of those people living their truly human lives before he continued on his way. There was a piece of him here, somewhere, a seed that had been planted but never watered. He imagined coming to one of these homes after a long day at work to his children and his beautiful wife. He wasn't sure if it was Claire. He couldn't see her face. Something he couldn't name stalked him down this road and whispered in his ear that though the town looked like where he should have lived, it didn't quite feel like it. Dark and battered storefronts peppered the decaying streetscape between the dim light given off by the surviving businesses. He felt like he'd lived here long ago and was finally coming home to find that the people who mattered to him had long since moved away. The shops, the homes, and the cars parked on the street were memories he was supposed to have but didn't. Specters of a past he should have lived. I feel lonely.